This is an interview with Mr. Philip Oliver, Route 2, Box 456B, White Pine, Tennessee. Interview conducted on February 27th, 1986 by Dr. Charles Johnson of the Department of History, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. University of Tennessee. It's all set up. You can just start right there. I can fill in anything.
But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, I like 2 weeks graduating from school, finishing this course.
What sort of training was it?
It was aviation. Aviation Mechanic School in Chicago, Illinois. It was a civilian school on 87th and Anthony, Chicago Vocational Technical Training School. The Navy had at least, they had about 32 instructors, civilian instructors, and they were running a course for Navy and Marine aviation machinist mates. In other words, ground crew mechanics more than anything else, because we were taught, back then we were taught seamanship, ordnance, ground handling of aircraft, navigation, basic navigation, weather. It was a general school, along with machine shop practices, shop math, machine shop theory, wire cables, hydraulics. It was a real good course, a real good program. And we were going to school 5 days a week. We had no liberty at all. We were transported back and forth from the Naval Armory now to put in Randolph Street out in the mouth of the Chicago River there in the bay.
Was your brother with you in this?
No,
or?
he was back in Quantico at the time, but I had gone up there to school. And there was 90 of us from Quantico, Virginia, went up there in July and started in school. And they put us through school. We were going from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 days a week. And when we would get on the bus, they had city buses chartered to take us back down Lakeshore Drive and back to the Armory. We would go in the Armory. It was just one big building with a compound out in front of it, out on a pier, and it was fenced off in front, and the 3 sides surrounded by water. We all slept on a big gym floor, 3 bunks high. There was about 600 Navy and Marine Corps personnel together. And we studied until 9 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock lights out. 6 o'clock in the morning, we were up and showered and getting dressed, had breakfast, and were on our way to school at 7. Got there at 8. And this was a routine, and it was actually more stringent and tougher than boot camp was actually in the preceding months before that. But they really were putting us through. Anyway, we graduated on the 19th of December, left that same day by a troop train, 90 of us, going back to Quantico, Virginia. And we traveled across Midwest and down through Pennsylvania and West Virginia, down through Harpers Ferry, and then to Quantico. We got in Quantico about 3 o'clock in the morning. And they put the train off on the siding with 6 cars and 2 baggage cars and a 9 or 6 Pullman sleepers. And we were all asleep, and we just slept until morning. When we got up in the morning, a sergeant in charge took our papers to the provost marshal or someplace and turned them in. And they told us that our unit had been shipped out to California. So we stayed on the train, and they cut orders for us to continue on to the West Coast. So we left sometime that evening, and we went down through Norfolk and down along the East Coast on the seaboard lines and crossed into Pensacola and to New Orleans. And we stopped in New Orleans overnight. They gave us 4-hour living in New Orleans. And then we went on across Texas, out in the little town of Brownwood. We ate breakfast one morning in Brownwood. We moved Cowtown down about 85 miles southwest of Dallas, and they just had dirt streets and board sidewalks and white clapboard buildings, but the train track was right down the middle of the main street, and it was 100 yards wide, I suppose, and the street on both sides. But it was just a little 2-block long town. Never will forget it, but we ate in this boarding house there and ate breakfast and got back aboard the train. Went on to Lubbock that afternoon, went to Flagstaff, and they took us off. That was Christmas Day in 1941. They took us off, fed us in the Fred Harvey house and restaurant in Flagstaff. Now, back in those days, Fred Harvey was big with the Santa Fe National Speaker. They gave us, I remember they fed us a dinner, and there was about 14 inches of snow on the ground in Flagstaff, and those pine trees, and the most beautiful place I've ever seen in life. And then we went on into California, and the next day, the daylight the next morning, we were into the valley, and we got in Los Angeles about noon and went on down to San Diego that evening. And I spent the night at North Island, and the next day we were transferred out to Kearney Mesa, which is now part of San Diego, but at that time it was out in the boondocks 15 miles north of San Diego. There was an auxiliary airfield up there that had no buildings at all. It was just grass, maintained a side runway. And whenever Lindbergh Field would be fogged in down in San Diego, they'd divert flights up there in emergency. And that was the area where, I don't know if you remember the Akron dirigible accident in 1930 to 39 when several sailors were holding on to the ropes and the gust of wind caught and raised it. Well, that was at Kearney Field where that happened. But anyway, we established a camp there. And of course, we were assigned the Fleet Post Office, and we were in the members of the Fleet Marine Force Pacific. And we carried Fleet Marine Force address from that December 19th until December 1944, I came back to the States. I was on the West Coast. It's hard to believe we didn't have any equipment. We had 8 officers. We had probably 125 to 150 enlisted men in this group. And 8 officers. We had 2 our DC-5s. They were R3Ds. High-wing Douglas. They only made 5 of them. And they were a forerunner to DC-3. And we carried 18 passengers. And they looked more like an A-20 or something like that than they did a transport. But we had 2 of those. And a couple of ducks, Grumman JO2s, the amphibians. And we had a Beechcraft, our Lockheed 10, and we had a Beechcraft, JRB, I believe, and a couple of SNJs, which was a 2-seat training plane. And this was our total planes in this VMJ squadron. We had a squadron of F4Fs, this was Marine Air Group 11 at the time, and we had a squadron of SBDs, and we had a squadron of SB2Us, and we had, I know there were 2 fighter squadrons and 2 bomber squadrons and the utility squadron, and a VMO squadron, but it was detached to North Island. And we established a camp around that area, and they started paving the field and started building. But I stayed at Kearney. We trained we had men coming in daily almost, and we would assimilate them into the unit. In March 1st, each squadron formed a group, and we became, from the 125 men, we formed a group of headquarters squadron, service squadron, and 2 utility squadrons. We got our first DC-3s about the middle of March. We began to get a few reserve officers in who were qualified to fly them. And one man in particular was a lieutenant colonel, or he was a captain at the time, the name of Harry Van Loo, who was a senior pilot at Eastern Airlines. He was a reserve officer in the Marine Corps. He was qualified on DC-3s, so he came in as training officer. And we became a training squadron. We opened a navigation school. Our commanding officer had been trained by this Navy Commander Weems, who ran the navigation school in Annapolis. He had trained 6 officers from Marine Corps involved in 1940, 41 on aerial navigation. So our commanding officer was Warren Sweetser, and he was one of those 6 officers that had gone through that school. So he, as commanding officer, he established a navigation school to start training navigators. We were checking out pilots. Our pilots had been trained in Pensacola, but had never been checked out in Quantico transport. We had to train all of our check crews, all of our flight crews. We had to pick out men who had enough training, and it was a hectic time. We were involved in our own security as well. We had maintained machine gun pits and machine gun watchout, and aircraft machine guns. I was out there when they had the day-long alert, and when the submarine was shelled Long Beach. I was there when they picked up the Japanese and transported them inland. I stayed on the West Coast until March of 43. We trained 2 squadrons and sent them out in September, October of 42. And they came to the South Pacific. And then we continued to check out crews until we got orders to move ahead to the South Pacific in March of 43. And we went aboard ship in San Diego, and we flew 16 planes over, and the ground crew and ground personnel went aboard ship, and we went out alone on a Dutch merchant vessel.
So before you leave the West Coast, you mentioned the Japanese being picked up and removed. Did you, as a Marine around that base, feel any kind of threat, or were you concerned about them? Or
no, really, they were there in the valley. They were in the general population. They were no threat, except that there was so much turmoil. And the Japanese had made a couple of appearances by sub off the coast. And we had spent several days on alert, and nights on watch, and really expecting an attack of some kind. And the point was, and the main reason that they were interred inland was for their own safety, because the civilian population was a threat to their safety, and even the service personnel. And at the start of World War II, in October, November of 1941, we were having discussions with Japan on trying to establish a better treaty, a better relationship with them. We'd had problems in 1938. They sank the Yangtze, the Panay in the Yangtze River, and then just said, so sorry. And we let those things slide, and we let them slide. There was an incident in the international section of Peking along in 1940 when the British and the American Marines and a different international contingents there of armed forces that were on embassy guard had to stand off the Japanese at the gates one time on the inner city. And they just crowd in, and we never made a strong protest about these things back then. I came home on Thanksgiving Day, and I had a 72-hour fast in 1941. I came home, and I was talking to, I went to high school, I was talking to a football coach over there, P.D. Seiler, and P.D. had been a veteran of World War I, and he was in France in the ambulance corps. And he and I were talking one afternoon. We walked downtown together, and anyway, Coach Seiler and I would walk downtown along in the afternoon, and we were talking. And I said to him, I said, you know, I was an 18-year-old brash young Marine private. I said, if the Japanese start anything, Coach, I said, we'll knock their socks off in 6 weeks' time. And he said to me, don't you ever sell those Japanese short. He said, if they get into a war with us, and he said, it looks like it might be, he said, they're going to give you a fight. And he said, you're going to find you have a fight on your hands. Well, I carried that with me for 4 years. I remembered those words. I talked to him many times after that. I thought a great deal of Coach, and he was right.
Told him he was right.
But that was the attitude we had in the Marine Corps.
Sure.
But we didn't have any equipment. And I started to tell you, we had to mount a propaganda campaign. First of all, okay, I'm going to let you lay up there for a little while. I've been away, and she's
good cat.
Trying to make up with me. She is a good house cat. But anyway, during that 6 to 8 month period from December the 7th until along about the middle of 1942, the newspapers were carrying a lot of propaganda type and posters. And you see them in railway stations, bus stations. They're slogan on the radio, you know. They had no television then. But they were building up a hatred for the Japanese, getting the people involved in war plants, getting them to take jobs in those plants, getting people to volunteer for the services and to form USOs and treat servicemen better, you know, and things. And it was a really a hectic time. I don't think American people, this particular civilian population, ever realized how little military equipment we had and how vulnerable we were that first 6 to 8 months from December the 7th until along about really the first offensive in August of 1942. And even then we didn't have enough equipment to do that job. But things began to come together, and this was where, with this propaganda, this hate propaganda, which they had to use at that time, and there was a reason for it, began to have a sort of a backfire effect on the Japanese population on the West Coast. And I believe it was March of 1942, February, March, that President Roosevelt signed the order evacuating the Japanese, interning them, and taking them inland to Utah and Idaho and places. But it was more, there was no real problem out there. It was more for their own safety. However, it was a traumatic experience for them because they were not looked on as really first-class citizens out there at that time. And yet they were good citizens. We know now, and we learned later. But it took families who had come there and worked and scrimped and saved for years to get a little bit of the money together to open a garage or gas station or a little fruit stand or something. They were thrifty. self-supporting people, and they were uprooted and just forced to sell their homes, what they could get out of them, or leave them. Their businesses the same way, and they couldn't, on the distress sale, you couldn't get your money out of the business. And this was going on over a period of 2 or 3 months till they got them moved inland to the camps. Later on, I think they realized the mistake, but it was really not a mistake at that time as far as what had to be done. We had to do a lot of things we didn't want to. In 1942, there were a lot of decisions made that would not normally have been made, and you wouldn't think of making them today, but they had to be done. You had to commit men when they didn't have proper equipment, and they didn't have the equipment.
Now, when you left from San Diego on board, did you have the feeling you were pretty well equipped and pretty well ready, or you?
Well, we did at that time because we'd had a year. We sent 2 units out, and they were pretty well equipped. And then we were receiving equipment that we'd never dreamed of having a year before. When we went over, we took some of what they called Dallas huts that were 16-foot square, plywood-sided, prefabricated units that could be set up in units of 3 or units of 1, and set up, on 16 by 16-foot platforms, and made into a livable unit with windows with screens on them and everything. And you could house, in a triple unit, you could house 10 men in it, And we had these with us so that we were getting away from tents. I lived in a tent from December of 1941 until December the 19th, 1944. I lived in a tent. I never lived in a building at all. I lived in a tent or a foxhole or something. Never was in a permanent building. But these Dallas huts were the most closest thing to permanent building we had. But when we got over there, we had those, and we had much better equipment than we had started out with. Tools, A-frames, overhaul equipment in the overhaul shop and things. But they took away the overhaul process from us and turned it over to service squadrons, and took some of our personnel and put them in service squadron. They had an A&E shop, and they had a special section for instruments and for engine overhaul and engine changes and everything, and set up a unit on the operations line, which made it much better because when you have 3 or 4 squadrons using the facilities, specialized facilities, you can get more efficiency out of it than you could if one squadron doing everything for itself, taking care of its own problem, and another squadron doing the same thing, because you have too much duplication. And you can schedule your personnel for around-the-clock work so that you have maintenance going on 24 hours a day, rebuilding going on 24 hours a day, and it makes a much better operation. We were in New Caledonia at Quantico on that particular operation, and our job was to fly supplies up through the islands and haul personnel and supplies, mail, money, or payroll checks, wounded personnel back. I carried many wounded men on board the plane. And we were just the air transport squadron for the South Pacific, because South Pacific Combat Air Transport and SCAT for short. And I stayed with them. I was a crew chief. I made master sergeant. I went up 1 stripe at a time, and I was a sergeant when I went overseas. I made private first class in January 1942, and it was a permanent promotion signed by President Roosevelt, because it was the last permanent promotion given out in the Marine Corps, and everything was temporary then. But then I made master sergeant 2 weeks before I was 21 years old. And February the 1st in 1944, I became a master sergeant. Up until that time, I was a technical sergeant, flying as crew chief on all through the islands up there. And there in my flight logbook, of most of the time that I was just overseas, we'd fly to Sydney, Australia, and back the next day. And then the next day, I'd take 3 or 4 days off. And my first mate would take the plane on the next flight. He'd come back, and then I'd take the next flight out.
Did you fly into Guadalcanal?
Oh, yes. We flew into Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Munda, Espiritu Santos, Ifadi, and the New Hebrides Islands, Norfolk Island, which I doubt if you've ever heard of Norfolk Island. It's a little island all by itself, halfway between New Caledonia and New Zealand. 400 miles from the nearest land. It's a little island about a mile wide and about 8 or 9 miles long. Most beautiful little place you've ever seen in your life. Part of the mutineers from the Bounty, the descendants were settled on that island back in the late 1800s. And they live in thatched roof English cottages with stucco cottages with rose gardens, driving horse and buggies, the most pastoral scene you've ever seen in your life. Beautiful place. Beautiful place. I've been in there 2 or 3 different times. We're New Zealand contingent on Air Force contingent on the island, and we would drop by and drop their mail off. When we come from Auckland, we'd drop their mail off to them. But I was in 16 different islands over there, and in the continent, including Sydney, Australia, and Brisbane, Australia, and Auckland, New Zealand, Norfolk, and of course New Caledonia, and Espiritu Santos and Ifadi in the New Hebrides Island. And then the next island up where there was an airfield was Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. And then above Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands had an air fighter strip. I stayed there later on I was transferred up there and stayed there, but as they would take the islands, we would follow right in. I've got a picture there of the crew taken in Munda on, I believe it's September the 7th, 1943, and the airfield was not open until September the 9th, but we went in and picked up 14 wounded New Zealanders and flew them out of there back to Guadalcanal and back to Tontuta. One of them had a very bad concussion, and they were rushing him back to New Zealand for brain surgery, and he was a very bad case. I just in Fort Worth this past September, Captain Allison, who was the pilot on that flight, and I were talking. I hadn't seen him since World War II, and we were discussing it, and I was telling him about that flight, and we were looking at that picture. He said, well, I really didn't know what we had aboard, because he said, I was always in the cockpit and I did the flying, and I let you fellas take care of all that. And he did, because, I mean, now some pilots took more than others, but we had this big wounded men on board, and with a corpsman, and of course I set up stretchers in the gurney hill for them, and we carried them in and loaded them on the plane, and a whole 14 of them back out there on that day. We've had celebrities on. I've hauled celebrities around over there and met people. I was with Artie Shaw for a little while over there in Auckland, New Zealand. I was with Bob Hope. I put Bob Hope on a small Piper Cub and strapped him in it. And he flew over to another little island 20 miles away to put on a show of performance. He and Jerry Colon and Patty Thomas, and I believe Francis Langford was with him at that time. There was two women and 3 men.
She often was with that crew.
And they were flown over to Pavuvu and put on their show in the afternoon for the 1st Marine Division. 1st Marine Division was not on the main island. They had picked an isolated island for their training island. There was a reason for it, and I'll explain a little more later. But anyway, during that year's time, I traveled all over the Pacific, and I got to see a great deal of it. I was in, now, just like in Bougainville, I went in there when they were still fighting, you know, on the perimeter, defense perimeter, 14 strip. And we'd get in and get out. Back earlier, we used to go in the Guadalcanal. We'd take off and fly over to the New Hebrides Island of Esprit of Santos. There's a big bomber strip up there at Laurel Field. And we would land there and stay until about 2 o'clock in the morning. We'd go out to the field at midnight, and I'd pre-flight the plane, and we'd get everything ready, and they'd be fueled up and all. And we'd take off at 2 o'clock in the morning and fly into Guadalcanal so that we could arrive just at 6 o'clock in the morning in daylight. Usually the Japanese air activity was over by that time. About 2 or 3 months, and then it got to where it was safe enough for us to stay over, so we'd fly to Guadalcanal in the daytime, stay overnight, and then take off the next morning and fly back. And then all up through the islands, it was the same way. As they would take Munda, we would go into, as soon as the airfield was open enough, we could get in and land. We'd land whatever supplies were needed. We'd drop air packs to the troops up there in the New Georgias for 1 week when it's spotted by air. And they opened a little fighter strip down on Saggy Point on the lower end of the New Georgias, about 60 miles south, would be southeast of Munda, and we'd go into there. But these little fighter strips, they were, you gotta remember, we're flying DC-3, R-5C Ds, R-4Ds, twins and planes, and we were going in on little strips, 2,600, 2,800 feet, coral strips, and we'd have to clear coconut trees on the end of the runway and get in, and just all you could do to get stopped, you know. And then we'd have to taxi back just as hard as we could into the trees and rev the engine up hard to get out of there. And then maybe the next place field you stopped didn't have 5,000-foot runway. But it was touch and go, little strips of Bella LaBelle, Onondaga, and the twin strips of Onondaga. And when you took off on this one runway, there was about a 40 or 50-foot cliff that just right off the edge of the water. It's just like taking off a carrier. If you weren't airborne by the time you got to the end of that runway, you were either going to fly or you was going to sit down in the water. And it's a very short runway. But at Bougainville, we had a good long strip. The one strip up there, bottom strip, Seabees got in there and they put down Martian in that and made a good strip out of that. And then a little island of Green Island, which was halfway between Bougainville and Revolve, that we took. Now, Green Island was the last island that we were involved in before I transferred out and left the organization. And at Green Island, there was a Navy lieutenant commander by the name of Richard Nixon, who was assistant operations officer at Guadalcanal under Harry Van Loo. And when he kept wanting an operations of his own, so they gave him Green Island. And I went in there one morning, Lieutenant Buckley and Lieutenant Hughes and myself, and there was 3 Navy TBFs that run together and crashed on the runway, and we had to circle in pea soup till they could get the wreckage pushed off the runway and heal up the dust. We finally got in there, and this tent with the front porch yard was the operations hut. Everything was makeshift and in the mud, and Lieutenant Richard Nixon was the operations officer there. I've got pictures of him when he was in the Navy over there. Later on, I went to Washington and had lunch with him one time when he was vice president. Met with him for about 3 hours one time. But he was one of the people that became famous after World War II. About that time, now this was in April of 1944, why I was transferred to the 1st Marine Division as the crew chief for the commanding general on his private airplane, the twin-engine Beechcraft TRB. And Lieutenant Robert Beecher and Lieutenant Mitchell, myself, and a staff sergeant named Stanley Centuries went up to the 1st Marine Division and took over this Beechcraft. We had 6 Piper Cubs, JR-2Bs, and we had 1 CB and 1 ex-Marine aviator and 4 or 5 civilian aviators, pilots with civilian pilot who volunteered to fly these Cubs. And the division was 20 miles away on the little island. There was just a roadway along the beach, big enough to land on. So we used the Cubs to transport personnel from the division over to the fighter strip at Makita Bay and Pabu, or Beniki rather, in the Russell Islands. And I kept the Beechcraft over there on the fighter strip. That's where the Blackfeet Squadron of Major Morgan originally started out up there. And now they had moved on up at that time to London and Bougainville. But we used these Piper Cubs for transportation. And from April of 1944 until December of 1944, my main job was to provide the aerial transportation and ground transportation to the 2-star general, Major William H. Rupertus, and his assistant division commander, 1-star general named Oliver Smith. And during that time, we'd have admirals and Marine generals coming and going. We would fly them back and forth, and I had to always put their rank on whatever. If I had a 2-star general aboard, I put 2-star. Now, if I had a 4-star admiral, I put the 4-star. Now, during that time, we decided we didn't need a co-pilot. Lieutenant Mitchell was not satisfied. He asked for transfer back to SCAF to go back in the outfit. So he was transferred out, and Lieutenant Beecher was General Rupertus' aide and his pilot. And then I flew as co-pilot. And I got to fly in these Cubs a little bit. And when we were ready in September, in August, we went aboard ship. I took 2 Piper Cubs and 4 men. One enlisted pilot named Woodrow Witherspoon, and Sergeant Sentries, and a Corporal Lowsman or something like that. I can't remember his last name. And myself, and we took the 2 Piper Cubs and we put took the wings off and put them in wooden crates, and took the Cubs aboard an LST and up the elevator and onto the top deck, tied them down, set the wing crates up around them, protect them, and they loaded aboard all the other equipment, these landing craft and alligator, these amphibious tanks and things, and parts of the 5th Regiment, parts of the 3rd Pioneer Battalion, this amphibious tractor company, and we spent about 2 weeks loading all these LSDs and getting everything ready, and all the transports, that they used, and the communication ships and all, formed a task force. And we went down to Guadalcanal, and we made a couple of practice landings on the beach at Guadalcanal, where the original landings were made.
Landings on Guadalcanal Beach.
And we went back aboard ship, and we formed up into a convoy, and we steamed up through the slot, up by the Admiralty Islands, and went north into the Central Pacific, and on September the 15th, we invaded Peleliu Islands. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, Dr. Johnson. I don't know if you've spent much time digging up in the history of World War II or not, but have you ever really given much thought as to the operations in the Pacific as rated as to the difficulty of one island against another? Where would you rank Peleliu in that category?
It's got to be someplace very close to the top of the heap for most difficult and most costly.
It is, but it's a little known fact in history.
Mm-hmm.
There was the June the 5th landings in Normandy, and the Paris was being liberated about that time, and there was so much going on in Europe that it never got much of a press play. However, the history books tell you that it was the 2nd most costly operation in the Pacific up to that time. We lost, out of 18,000 men, we had 9,000 casualties, 50%. We had 13,000 men, 1,300 men killed, and the rest of them were casualties on that. It, to me, was my first real beachhead, and it was an awesome thing to go through. I spent 5 weeks on that island, sleeping in foxholes, and I went 5 weeks without having a hot meal. Sleep in the rain, lay down on the ground at night, or bunkers, wherever you could get in before you shelter yourself. And I had work to do, and we did it.
What was the weather? You said
Well,
rain,
we experienced typhoon even while we were there, but it would be hot as right on the equator almost. Be hot in the daytime, but I've seen a wind come across and typhoon. It dropped down 45, 50 degrees, and you just about freeze for a little while. I've got a picture. I'll show you how I dressed. It's on that. And when the weather changed, you feel it darn fast. Something here.
I see one back here.
Well, yeah. No, there's another one that goes in here. Maybe they're in here somewhere. Well, this is, you can see with no shirts and short cut off, and like this. And when that rain would come in, and it would turn gray and misty, just like a fog sweep over that isle, you couldn't get warm. And we didn't have extra clothing. I had a change of clothing, and that was all. I can't figure where those pictures are because I had them. Well, here's my original orders transferring me to the 1st Marine Division.
That's an interesting shot thing.
This is TBF. We had I crewed one of those for a little while, but this Beechcraft that we have here, I got these out just to establish a little credibility. This is the Beechcraft that was the general's private plane.
Oh,
He had a 12-year-old daughter, and her nickname was Sleepy, and the plane was named for her. And this was our crew. This was Robert Beecher, Robert Mitchell. This was Corporal Mathis. This was Sentries, myself.
mm-hmm.
These two men were sent back, and Beecher and Sentries and I remained with the plane. And I flew I was with the general every day. I talked to him just like I talked to you. This was the original Naval Armory at Chicago, and this was overseas at Contuta. This was taken in the Russell Islands, and I had a war correspondent by the name of George Millen and a combat photographer by the name of Fitzgerald, who was a photographer on the Milwaukee Journal. And they came over one day and asked me if I would take a Jeep and take them down to this naval pier down there. The New Zealand, this was a New Zealand woman, and they'd just opened the Red Cross. And so I took them down, and they were doing an article on her, and they asked me if I'd stand there and pose like a special horseshoes with her. This is the DC-3s that we used in the island. And I was I've got these pictures, but I took them out last year to take to Fort Worth with me, I believe, and never put them back. There's a Marine Museum
At Quantico.
at Quantico, Virginia. It opened in 1979, and I went up there. I was up in Massachusetts. I came back down through there, and I stopped, walked up to the gate of the museum. There's a corporal on guard there, and I talked to him, and I just happened to look right straight in front of me, and here sat the Beechcraft. Now this is not the original, but it was a facsimile of the 1st Marine Division Beechcraft. I said to the young corporal, I said, I was crew chief on that in World War II. And I've got some good pictures of it, better pictures around somewhere, but I don't know where they are.
You'll come across it.
I had a lot of pictures. Fitzgerald would make pictures and blow them up anytime I asked him for anything, and I've got a lot of, these are pictures of aerial photographs of the island of Peleliu during the fighting, and I'll have to look back there.
45 after you got back.
Yeah,
to
that's when
California.
I came back to the States. I came back to the States. I went to Buffalo, New York, went through the Army Air Force Training Command School up there on the R5Cs, went back to California and was crewing those. I was engineering chief on a squadron of those when the war ended, and I had my enlistment had ended, so I just asked to be discharged, and I got out of service September the 27th, 1945.
Did you come right back here then? Or?
I came back home. Here's my original discharge.
Mm-hmm.
And I came home on October the 5th, and I got home midnight on Wednesday night. On Thursday morning, I went downtown, stopped in Frida's drugstore to have a cup of coffee at the soda fountain, because it was the gathering place in the whole town. And the manager of J.C. Penney Company came across the street, and having a cup of coffee, shook my hand and said, "When did you get home?" And I said, "Last night about midnight." He said, "How about coming to work for me?" And I said, "Well, I'll consider it, Pete." I said, "What?" He said, "No, I need somebody now." He said, I'm serious." He said, "I've got a job for you." And I said, "Well, give me a day or two to think about it." Anyway, on Saturday morning, I arrived home on midnight Wednesday night. On Saturday morning, I went to work. I never drew any GI benefits of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
I never was on this 5220 rocking chair pay. I went right to work, and I worked for them for 6 or 8 weeks. And I went back to my old original job. I worked at that for about 2 months, and I went to work in Nashville for a firm, went on the road for them, got married. I went down to Georgia Tech and applied for admission. They turned me down. And after 6 months later, they wrote me a letter and told me that they had instituted a makeup program where I would be eligible to go ahead and enter my freshman year and make up. I need credit in foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, my wife was in the hospital, sick, and I was married and my nose had a grandson, so I never took advantage of it. I won 3 battle stars in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. In Solomons, New Jersey, and Peleliu.
And I was awarded Air Crewman's Wings for combat flying. I went on hand grenade missions in the Piper Cub and got shot down on Little
really?
Island.
Where was that? Was that on near Peleliu?
Yes.
Or,
The island, I guess, was Negacivas.
I don't know that island, I guess.
Well, it is really just a part of that. It's the next island up. And it's only about 100-yard causeway separating 100-yard channel. But there was a small fighter strip on it. There was this ridge. I'm going to get those pictures out so I can show you. There was this ridge that the Japanese had. They were holed up in this ridge. They had a fortified with caves nickeled all through it. In fact, the matter, they didn't get them all out of there until even 1947. I think there were 12 of them surrendered after 2 years or 3 years. But they were holed up in there. And then we were being shelled from when we would try to, our regiment combat team would try to take a hill or work out a certain section of a road to protect the road because there was a road went around the island and the Japanese would shoot even down on the road. So they'd try to take combat teams and clear that section out. And they would come in for shelling from over on the other island. And on the 28th day of September, when the 5th Marine Regiment landed on that little island, I guess, and secured it on a 24-hour operation. I think it was secured on the 29th. But that morning, Lieutenant Beecher had taken General Rupertus up to watch the 5th Regiment go across this channel. They went across and they only had some Sherman tanks because they thought they could stay in shallow water and get them across. And he also had some of these amphibious tractors, these alligators. And they took the regiment across onto the beach on the other side of that channel. Now, during that time, they were fighting right off the road in these hills. We had combat teams fighting the Japanese here, and you could see them. I mean, you know, you could see our Marines behind trees shooting into the caves up there, and the Japanese shooting back. And they didn't bother us so much, you know, in the Cubs. We'd fly on 500 feet or so and stay out of the way and watch these. And the general and Lieutenant Beecher was in one plane, and Witherspoon and General Moore, the two-star general commanding 1st Marine Air Wing, was in another plane, the Cub, and they were watching this amphibious operation, you know, from the air, and they spotted a Japanese artillery piece. There was a couple of pillboxes and a long slit trench between them, right on the edge of the airfield over on this island, and there was a long slit trench and was fortified, you know, and there was a Japanese 77mm artillery piece in a bunker in there they spotted. So they came back and the general was all excited about it. And Lieutenant Beecher said, get some hand grenades and let's go back. So he and I went up, I put 8 hand grenades I jumped in the back seat, put these hand grenades down on the floor. They were in those round canisters, just fragmentation grenades. And we lined up on the run on this slit trench, and we'd practiced this 300 feet. A hand grenade would explode just about on impact. It takes the fuse normally is 3 seconds, and at 300 feet it would just about hit. It falls about 123 a second or so, but it just hit it, and just on impact it would explode. You know. So we got lined up at 300 feet at slow flight. We'd come down, I'd pull a pin, release the grenades, you know. We'd go on, turn around, come back. And we made 7 passes, and I kept hearing rifle fire, and I said to him, an automatic fire, and I said, we're getting shot at, we better get out of there. Just about that time, he said, I'm hit, and he was hit in the leg, and went into a dive, and I reached and got a hold of him and pulled him back, and we got the plane straightened out, and I got it back down to Peleliu to the field, and landed and got him in the first aid. I taxied that airplane back over to the area, and I got out and looked, and there was 6 bullet holes right down along the side, right by they knocked the back window out, you know, right in the back seat, 1 up through the wing and 1 up through the windshield. And we were being shot at. I'm not joking. The
Cub's a little plane. You've got a picture of it here.
Yeah, but those bullets that went into that airplane right by me, and I wanted to read something here. I think it's in here somewhere. I didn't realize this thing had gone deteriorated so much, but It was a newspaper article. Let's see, it's a clipping in Morristown in the journal.
It's one of those planes that you were in, wasn't it?
This is an OI-1. The Cubs are smaller yet. I'll show you the Cub. We were the kind of the forerunners. This was one of them here, and I've flown in that one.
Looks a little fragile.
But let me see if I can find that.
Mm-hmm.
I came back from Peleliu in October, and I was over at the Vision.
So I take some time and get some oxygen. You a little better?
I used my ventilator. Our staging, our rear base, from Peleliu. On the 20th of October, I went aboard ship and moved out of there. And I arrived back around the 1st of November sometime. The day that we left Peleliu, they were landing in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was on the 20th of October, because we heard it that night on board ship. And when we came back, we were kind of broken up. Units, were pretty well cut up. And I was on board a marine or a merchant marine ship, and there was about 140 of us on it. We had the remnants of this war dog platoon. There was about 25 or 30 of these Doberman pinschers. They had them tied all over the rear deck, this dog platoon. And that was the worst cruise I ever had in my life. I had 2 weeks. I'm telling you, those dogs were. I saw him bite one man in the calf of the leg, and he couldn't walk. And I never seen such a terrible looking bruise in my life. But every night they'd say a dog loose on the deck, and everybody'd have to go below deck and protect themselves till they could catch it, but it.
Boy, must have fierce dogs. Huh?
Well, they some of them were. Those dogs are individuals like humans are, and they're trained for certain things. Now, some of the dogs were attack dogs, some of them were messengers, and some of them were dogs who just signaled alerts. But you didn't know what dog was what. And there's one handler for each dog, and very seldom is there another handler for them. And the thing was that they had been through this combat, and like the men, they were on edge too, and they were just dangerous to be around. And people get careless. You can't believe how careless people can be in total disregard for safety after going through a traumatic experience of that nature, 5 or 6 weeks of combat. They don't look at anything, and they're not afraid of anything much more than they just sort of ignore things. You go through a change from the time that we landed in Guadalcanal and got back aboard ship, and we knew then that it was strictly business, and we were going to face the enemy. There was, I suppose, 350 of us on board this LST for that 20 or 21 days from the time that we landed there till we landed at Peleliu. And during that 2 to 3 week period, they gradually became friendly with each other. They attended church services, and particularly the day or 2 days before the landing, everybody was trying to help each other get their gear straightened out, pack ammunition, pack key rations. everybody was kind of looking after each other. And the overall feeling was unspoken, but it was the fact that we've got to face this